In the 1960s, Bob Crane appeared to have everything an actor could possibly dream of. With his perfect smile, quick wit, and natural charm, he captured the hearts of millions across America. Night after night, families gathered around their television, sets to watch him as Colonel Robert Hogan, the clever and charismatic leader in the hit sitcom Hogan's Heroes. To the world, he was the embodiment of television stardom, a man who could make people laugh with ease, who carried himself with confidence, and who seemed to live a life of joy and success. Off-screen, he was just as magnetic. Friends and colleagues described him as warm, approachable, and endlessly funny. He had the kind of personality that filled a room, the sharp humor that left everyone entertained. To many, Bob Crane seemed not only talented, but also untouchable, a man riding the unstoppable wave of Hollywood's golden age. Yet beneath the polished exterior, cracks were already beginning to form. What the public didn't see was the private man wrestling with his own compulsions and hidden desires. Behind the charming grin and light-hearted persona was someone who craved constant excitement, whose passions would take him down darker paths. What began as a career built on laughter would unravel into betrayal, scandal, and ultimately a violent death that remains one of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Bob Crane's story is not just one of fame and fortune, but of a double life that consumed him. To understand how America's favorite television colonel went from sitcom stardom to a brutal end, we must go back to the beginning, before the spotlight, before the scandals, to the rise of a man who seemed destined for greatness. Before Bob, Crane was a household name on television. He was already making waves on the radio. Born in Waterbury, Connecticut in 1928, Crane discovered early on that he had a gift for performance. His ability to mimic voices, his impeccable timing, and his natural charisma made him a standout from a young age. After high school, he began pursuing a career in broadcasting, landing a job as a radio announcer in the late 1940s. By the 1950s, Crane's career truly began to take shape in Los Angeles. He became the morning show host on KNX, one of the city's biggest stations. Known as the man of 1,000 voices, he entertained listeners daily with his quick improvisations, impressions, and witty banter. He had a knack for connecting with celebrities, and his studio became a hotspot for Hollywood's elite. Marilyn Monroe, Bob Hope, Charlton Heston, and countless others all made appearances on his program. Crane's interviews were never stiff or formal. Instead, they felt lively, humorous, and unpredictable. His reputation grew so strong that even Walt Disney himself referred to Crane as the fastest wit in the West. It was a compliment that perfectly captured his quick mind and effortless humor. For many in the industry, it was only a matter of time before Crane made the leap from radio to television. That opportunity came in 1961 when legendary TV writer Carl Reiner appeared on Crane's show. Impressed by Crane's timing and personality, Reiner offered him a guest role on The Dick Van Dyke Show. Crane played a philandering husband in the episode, and though it was just a brief appearance, it opened the door to more acting opportunities. Soon after, he secured a recurring role as Dr. Dave Kelsey, a cheerful dentist, on The Donna Reed Show. By 1965, Crane's agent presented him with a new project, a sitcom called Hogan's Heroes. At first, Crane assumed it was a war drama. Only a. Later did he realize it was something far more unusual, a comedy set in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II. The concept was risky, even controversial, but Crane saw the potential. His role as Colonel Hogan, the clever leader of Allied prisoners who constantly outsmarted their bumbling German captors, fit him perfectly. The show was an instant success. Running for 6 seasons from 1965 to 1971, Hogan's Heroes turned Crane into one of the most recognizable faces on television. He earned 2 Emmy nominations. His image appeared on billboards and lunchboxes, and he became a fixture in magazines across the country. For millions of viewers, Bob Crane was the smiling, quick-witted colonel who always had a plan. On screen, he was living the dream. But even as his fame soared, those closest to him began noticing subtle changes. His appetite for excitement grew, his personal life showed signs of strain, and off-camera, shadows were forming that would eventually consume him. Behind the warm smile and magnetic charm that made Bob Crane famous, a different reality was quietly unfolding. In the mid-1960s, around the height of his television fame, Crane developed a growing fascination with photography. At first, it seemed harmless. He enjoyed experimenting with cameras, testing new video equipment, and taking portraits. But what began as a simple hobby slowly morphed into something far more personal and troubling. The turning point came when Crane was introduced to John Henry Carpenter, a salesman for Sony Electronics. The introduction came through Richard Dawson, Crane's co-star on Hogan's Heroes. Carpenter specialized in providing Hollywood clients with the latest video equipment, and he and Crane quickly bonded over their shared interest. Soon, Carpenter was helping Crane set up recording devices in hotels, on the road, and even in private residences. What might have seemed like an innocent friendship grew into a partnership that alarmed many of Crane's friends. Together, Crane and Carpenter began frequenting bars and nightclubs. Thanks to Crane's celebrity status, they had no trouble attracting attention from women. Crane often introduced Carpenter as his manager, and the two became inseparable. Wherever Crane went, Carpenter seemed to follow. But the true concern lay in how Crane used his equipment. More and more, he became obsessed with filming his encounters with women. His private world was filled with cameras, tripods, and tapes, evidence of a life hidden from the public eye. Colleagues noticed that Crane seemed distracted on set, preoccupied with his hobby rather than his acting. The obsession also took a toll on his personal life. His marriage to Ann Tertzian, his high school sweetheart and the mother of his 3 children, crumbled under the strain. After more than 2 decades together, they divorced. Not long after, Crane married Patricia Olson, known to Hogan's Heroes fans as Sigrid Valdis, who played Hilda on the show. But the same patterns repeated themselves. Even while filming wholesome projects like Disney's Superdad in 1973, reports surfaced of Crane's troubling behavior off-set. Disney executives, known for their strict family-friendly image, were unsettled by what they heard. His reputation in Hollywood began to suffer. By the mid-1970s, Crane was no longer the television star he had once been. He found steady work in stage productions, often performing in dinner theaters across the country. He remained determined to rebuild his career, but his private life and his ongoing relationship with John Carpenter continued to overshadow him. Those close to Crane began to worry. His behavior, once considered eccentric, had become consuming. For all the laughter he brought to audiences, the private man behind the jokes seemed increasingly lost in a world of obsession, one that few could have predicted would end in tragedy. By the late 1970s, Bob Crane's career and personal life stood at a crossroads. He was no longer the face of a hit sitcom, but rather a working actor touring small theaters. Though he continued to draw audiences, the prestige of television fame was behind him. Yet those who knew him say he seemed determined to change. He wanted to leave behind old habits, move on from toxic friendships, and perhaps start fresh both professionally and personally. At the same time, his relationship with John Carpenter had become strained. Once close companions, Crane reportedly told friends that Carpenter had become more of a burden than a friend. Crane wanted to distance himself, but Carpenter continued to insert himself into Crane's life. Their friendship, once built on curiosity and excitement, was now a source of tension. Crane also confided in friends about his second marriage. He was considering divorcing Patricia Olson, just as he had ended his first marriage years earlier. It seemed as though Crane wanted to wipe the slate clean. At 49 years old, he was nearing a milestone, his 50th birthday, and perhaps was searching for a way to begin the next chapter of his life on a different path. But change, especially when habits are deeply ingrained, is never easy. Cranes. Life was still filled with contradictions. On stage, he was professional, talented, and committed to his craft. Offstage, the darker side of his private world continued to follow him, especially as Carpenter remained nearby. In the summer of 1978, Crane was performing in Beginner's Luck at the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. Friends noticed he seemed optimistic about the future. He spoke openly about making changes, about ending relationships that no longer served him, and about focusing once again on his work. But unknown to him, time was running out. Before he could take those steps, his life would come to a sudden, violent end, an ending that left Hollywood in shock and raised questions that remain unanswered decades later. On the morning of June 29, 1978, Bob Crane's co-star Victoria Berry went to check on him after he failed to show up for a lunch meeting. What she found inside his apartment at Winfield Place in Scottsdale, Arizona, would haunt her and Hollywood for decades to come. Crane was discovered lying in bed, brutally murdered. The injuries to his head were severe, and investigators later suggested the weapon may have been a camera tripod. An electrical cord was also found near the body, though it was not the cause of death. The scene was both shocking and puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery, and little disturbance in the room. Whoever had killed Crane had likely been someone he trusted enough to let inside, or someone who entered while he was asleep. The discovery shocked the entertainment industry. The man who had once been the smiling face of Hogan's heroes was now at the center of a grisly murder mystery. Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward John Carpenter. Just days earlier, Carpenter had flown into Phoenix to spend time with Crane. The two had dinner together the night before the murder and, according to some reports, even watched some of their private recordings. Carpenter told police he returned to his motel afterward, but witnesses would later cast doubt on his timeline. The crime scene itself revealed the private side of Crane's life in a way the public had never imagined. Cameras, tripods, videotapes, and cables filled the apartment. Investigators uncovered recordings that detailed Crane's private encounters, confirming the rumors of his double life. For fans, the revelation was devastating. The beloved television star they had known was suddenly recast in headlines as a man consumed by scandal. For his family, the revelations added to their grief. Not only had they lost a husband and father in a brutal, senseless way, but they also had to grapple with the exposure of his most private struggles. The Scottsdale Police Department quickly focused on Carpenter as their main suspect. He had both motive and opportunity, and the evidence pointed to him. Yet despite the suspicions, the case was far from straightforward. What was clear from the beginning, however, was that this was not a random act of violence. It was personal. Someone close to Crane had ended his life. The question was who and why. The investigation into Bob Crane's murder was plagued with challenges from the start. Scottsdale, Arizona, in 1978, was not equipped to handle a high-profile Hollywood homicide. Mistakes were made, evidence was mishandled, and crucial details were lost. All signs pointed to John Carpenter, but the evidence was largely circumstantial. Police discovered blood smears in Carpenter's rental car, but DNA testing was still in its infancy. At the time, they could not conclusively tie it to Crane. Carpenter was arrested and charged with the murder, but in 1994, more than 16 years after the crime, he went to trial and was acquitted. The jury found the evidence too weak to convict. For Crane's family, the outcome was crushing. His son, Robert Crane, Jr., has spoken publicly about his father's double life, acknowledging both the laughter he brought to millions and the darker habits that contributed to his downfall. The family has lived with the unresolved questions ever since. In the decades since his death, Bob Crane's legacy has remained complicated. On one hand, he is remembered as the witty, talented star of Hogan's heroes, a man who could make audiences laugh with ease. On the other, his story is forever linked to scandal, obsession, and a violent end that still has no official resolution. Bob Crane's life was a mixture of brilliance and tragedy, a reminder that behind Hollywood's brightest smiles often lie untold struggles. His murder remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in entertainment history, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by questions as by laughter. More than 4 decades after his death, Bob Crane's story continues to fascinate, disturb, and sadden audiences. His rise and fall represent both the allure and the dangers of fame. For many who grew up in the 1960s, Crane will forever be remembered as Colonel Hogan, the quick-witted leader who always outsmarted the enemy and made viewers laugh. Reruns of Hogan's Heroes still play around the world, ensuring that Crane's most famous role lives on long after his passing. Yet his legacy is not one-dimensional. The scandal surrounding his private life and his brutal murder has kept him a subject of books, documentaries, and even films. In 2002, the movie Autofocus, starring Greg Kinnear as Bob Crane and Willem Dafoe as John Carpenter, attempted to capture the complexity of his life. While the film was met with mixed reactions, especially from Crane's family, it reignited public interest in his story and introduced him to a new generation. Scholars and pop culture historians often cite Crane's case as one of Hollywood's earliest examples of a celebrity downfall amplified by scandal. At a time when the media was less invasive than it is today, the exposure of Crane's private world shocked the public. Some saw him as a victim of obsession and